Hey everyone, it's Anime Reaper coming at you with another What If Naruto Found Uzuamki Library, Part 4. This fanfiction was written by S. Targon. If you like this what if and want more like it, please like and subscribe to my channel and don't forget to check the description and leave a comment down below. Without further ado, let's get started. Chapter 4. Geniuses of Hard Work. Chapter 4. Naruto leapt from roof to roof as dawn began streaking the eastern sky. He flexed his left hand repeatedly, trying to work out the annoying tingles. On Kurenai-sensei's advice, he'd picked up a field alarm at one of the outfitter shops. A shinobi on a mission might desire to wake at a specific time, or to limit the amount of rest he did allow himself to take. However, a conventional alarm clock was far too noisy to use when a mission might require stealth. At some point, an extremely clever cloud shinobi devised a portable clock powered by small, but powerful batteries, charged with a simple Raitenjutsu. Instead of ringing a bell to wake its owner, the ninja clock sent a pulse of electricity through a pair of wires attached to the owner's body. Naruto slipped the metal rings onto his fingers before finally falling asleep the previous night, trusting the device to wake him for his training session. The problem was that he stayed up fairly late beforehand. He'd been upset after the confrontation at Ichiraku's, and the thought of his teammates listening to Sakura berate him just made his stomach twist even worse. He didn't really understand why Shino and Hinata were willing to treat him differently than the others. A small part of him wondered if they would suddenly wake up and see him like everyone else. The niggling fear of that occurring kept him from even thinking about taking Kurenai's advice. He'd rather no one ever knew about his prisoner. Such thoughts kept Naruto awake far later than he realized, and he'd evidently slept through the first several pulses of his new alarm clock. Whoever built this particular model must have had some experience with sound sleepers, though. The pulse that finally woke him up left his hand numb and tingling. That complicated things as he rushed around his small apartment, trying to get ready with only one hand working well. Still, he did manage to make it on time, and arrived at the designated training area at the stroke of 6. Of course, what he found there immediately had him wondering if he was still asleep and dreaming. Guy-sensei, he supposed, was a large, muscular man in a green leotard. The outfit was loose on his frame, for which Naruto was grateful, and over it he wore a Chiyunin vest. Topping all of this was the ugliest bowl cut Naruto had ever seen. Though the one on the kid standing next to him was close competition. Standing next to Guy was a half-size duplicate that Naruto supposed was this Rock Lee person. He didn't have the vest, though he did have the orange leg warmers that matched with nothing else. After meeting Kurenai-sensei, Naruto was beginning to dislike that color for some reason. "Ah, you are right on time," the man boomed in a loud voice that seemed to have no business belonging to a ninja. "You must be eager to start banking the fires of your youth." Naruto had no idea what that just meant, so he used one of Kurenai-sensei's parting words of advice. He just smiled and nodded. Oh. Hours later, Naruto was bruised, tired, and hungry. Despite his handicap with ninjutsus, Rock Lee was still a formidable opponent. He proved this by beating Naruto senseless every time they sparred. Possibly the most irritating thing about this experience was that eerie smile he wore the whole time. Naruto was used to a variety of expressions from his opponents. Sneers and emotionless masks he was used to, having known both Sasuke and Shino. Scowls were the norm with Kiba, and board calculation was to be expected from Shikamaru. But Rock and his teammates were from the previous year's graduating class at the Konoha Ninja Academy, so Naruto had never sparred with him before. It was a little odd to fight someone who never stopped grinning, even on the rare occasions when Naruto actually managed to land a blow. Guy-sensei's idea of training consisted of Naruto and Lee sparring for nearly 2 hours straight, while he watched and nodded thoughtfully. By the end, Naruto realized that Lee was starting to take it easy on him, which actually stung his pride a little bit. That drove him to fight even harder, but every blow he landed was just further proof that Lee was holding back. Finally, the older boy went to make one of his flying spin kicks, but was just a hair slow on the launch. Instead of ducking or blocking, Naruto stepped inside the kick and sunk his left first into the boy's stomach. Lee fell down, for the first time that morning. When he got up, he was still smiling, but he nodded and Naruto realized he was breathing heavily. "Yosh," Guy said, startling the genin. "Kurenai was right. You will make a most challenging sparring partner for my Lee." No, Naruto said, shaking his head. I barely hit him at all. He usually didn't let his frustration show like this, but he was tired, cranky, and humiliated at how thoroughly he'd been schooled all morning. Naruto? Guy said in a disappointed voice that made Naruto want to shiver. Something about the man made his skin crawl, just a little. Don't let the fires of youth gutter out so quickly. Not many of your age can hold their own against Lee, and especially not for 2 hours. I've never seen anyone wear him down like that since he became a genin. Lee abruptly straightened and bowed. Naruto-san. We must train together. Only then will we become true geniuses of hard work. Naruto scratched his head. What the hell were these crazy people talking about? Geniuses of hard work, he asked in a dubious voice. Yes, Guy said gravely. Konoha has many geniuses. Lee's teammate Niji is considered a genius by many of the Hyugas. Uchiha Sasuke in your class was also classified as one. But it is one thing to be born a genius, to be given talent like a gift one has not earned. It is quite another to be like Lee, a genius of hard work. He has no special abilities or skills, only his own determination to be the best. His willingness to work for his goal is more valuable than being any sort of lesser genius, and will take him much farther in the end. Naruto frowned as he considered the strange Jonin's words. It pleased him, just a little, to hear Sasuke described as a lesser type of genius by someone else. But something else he said echoed Kurenai-sensei's words. A little hard work can make up for a lot. The day will come when Shino and Hinata's lives may depend on you. Mine as well. He gave a sharp nod as he made up his mind. Good. Lee. Guy barked. You still need to work on your endurance if Naruto can wear you out. Double your weights and run 5 laps around Konoha. Lee practically cheered at this announcement, which confused Naruto even more. But as the boy strapped heavy bracers to his forearms and began running, Guy took him aside to work on his forms. Naruto had never had a lot of individual instruction before, so it was a novel experience as Mato Guy had him settle into one fighting stance after another and began correcting his posture and foot placement. At first, all the tiny adjustments seemed silly. Did it really matter if his lead foot was turned slightly outward instead of slightly inward? But he remembered what Shino had said about the man's reputation, so he did as he was instructed. When Guy then had him shift from one stance to another, using the corrected forms, Naruto was surprised at how different it felt. His surprise must have been visible, because Guy began to explain the reasons for the corrections. The turned-in foot affected how the knee flexed, and allowed him to retreat more fluidly if he faced a strong attack. The slightly flexed rear knee allowed him to chamber a kick with that foot an instant faster. After each explanation, Guy would ease him through the motion, making Naruto repeat it at least 3 times so the proper form would have a chance to engrave on his memory. Next they began working on punches and blocks in conjunction with the corrected stances. Everything seemed to flow together much better than Naruto remembered. The man's voice was almost hypnotic as he talked Naruto through all the basic Taijutsu moves. He never seemed to lose patience or become distracted. It was still a little unnerving, but Naruto was more entranced by the way everything seemed to flow together. Time passed a lot quicker than Naruto realized, because they'd just finished running through all the basics when Lee staggered into the clearing, red-faced and breathing hard. So, of course, Guy immediately had them spar again. It was slightly more even this time. Lee was clearly winded, though he soon got his breathing back under control. Naruto's taijutsu was a little smoother, and he occasionally scored a glancing hit on his opponent. Lee was sweating hard, but he was still smiling as they fought. Dimly, Naruto realized that fighting when he was tired was just one more challenge for the boy, one more way to make himself a little bit better. Naruto wondered if he should start worrying when such odd people began to make sense to him. It was after 9 o'clock and both boys were considerably worse for the wear when Guy called a halt to the sparring. Naruto brushed some dirt from his sleeve. He wouldn't have time to go home and wash it before he needed to meet his team. Both he and Lee were red-faced and sweating. They both had bits of grass sticking to their uniforms from where they'd been knocked down, and their hands trembled slightly as they froze in their ready positions at Guy's command. That's enough for today, Guy said with a nod. Naruto, you should report to Kurenai. Lee and I will take a jog to cool down. I'll expect to see you here tomorrow at the same time. Naruto aped Lee's bow to his sensei, and watched with some amusement as Lee struggled to keep up the pace Guy set as they ran out of the training area. Naruto walked a little slower toward training area 19. While he didn't have time to clean up, he was really starving, especially since he hadn't even had time for a cup of instant ramen when he finally woke up that morning. Now that he'd acknowledged it, his hunger waxed rhapsodic as he made his way down the street. Most village shopkeepers were just opening up for the day, and he'd already spent over 3 solid hours training and sparring. Being groggy and half-starved, it was no surprise that his feet picked their own route, and he found himself passing Ichiraku's. Surprisingly, it was open, serving hot tea and dumplings to merchants and workers as they began their day. The old man did a slight double take when he saw Naruto approach. "I'm sorry, but we haven't even started making the broth for noodles yet." Naruto tried not to let his disappointment show. "Kurenai-sensei says I need to eat something besides ramen all the time, anyway," he said with a shrug. "Bite your tongue. She'll put me out of business," the old man said with a laugh. "You look like you've been working hard already. I've got some nice hot tea, how about some rice balls and pickles to go with it?" Naruto nodded and sat down at the counter. The square plate that was soon placed in front of him was crowded with food, but he wasn't about to complain. The hot tea washed down the sticky rice and made a nice contrast with the sharp taste of the pickles. As he finished, he felt new energy flow into his limbs and knew stopping here had been a good idea. As he was finishing his tea, the old man took his plate and leaned forward a little. "I'm glad I got to meet your friends last night," he said with a smile as Naruto patted his stomach. "They aren't friends, so much as..." Naruto began but trailed off. He wasn't completely sure what he wanted to say. They were teammates, and that was it. "They're good kids," old man Ichiraku corrected him gently. He smiled ruefully. "They tore those snot-nosed brats a new one after you left." Naruto wasn't sure he heard the man correctly. "Nanny?" "Yeah," the old man nodded as he collected Naruto's teacup. "They really didn't seem to like the way those others talked to you. I think that little Hyuga girl gave that pink-haired one the scare of her life." "Hinata?" Naruto asked in disbelief. "Yeah, that was her name," the old man smiled. "She did something weird with her eyes. I couldn't see her do anything with her hands, but that other girl jumped back like she'd been burned. If that little girl is a Hyuga, I can see why everyone steps lightly around her clan." Naruto was confused as he thanked the man and paid for his breakfast. As he resumed his journey toward the training area, he tried to puzzle out their behavior. He didn't know why they stuck up for him, especially since he wasn't even there to see it happen. But knowing they had done so made him feel unaccountably warm. The more he thought about that, the stranger Naruto felt. He knew as he approached the training area that he needed to do something about this. "Oh." Kurenai was mildly curious as to how Naruto's training session with Guy and Lee would go. She'd been tempted to look in on them, but Guy was a jonin and his senses were particularly acute. He might take offense if he thought she was questioning his abilities, and she didn't want to do anything to jinx the deal they had struck. It was a little unusual by Konoha standards, but she felt it was the best way to get Naruto's level of proficiency up to where it should be. She felt unaccountably pressured in this respect. Perhaps it was that unknown group the Hokage mentioned, maybe it was her own instincts. Either way, she had the feeling that the sooner the boy learned how to effectively defend himself and his teammates, the better. Hinata arrived first, as seemed to be her habit. She was visibly more composed than she had been the day before. Kurenai hoped that her words, and the successful completion of their first mission, had bought the girl some peace. She hoped that sending her genins out on an obvious team bonding exercise would ease them past any potential tensions that might arise. She was particularly concerned about the Hyuga girl. If her assessment of the girl's father was accurate, she'd likely need a safe haven within the team. If she was uncomfortable with her teammates, that would not be available. The girl greeted Kurenai in her usual, hesitant manner, but from her posture, the jonin could tell that something was wrong. "Hinata," she asked as a quiet inspiration overtook her, "how did dinner at Ichiraku go?" Something about the girl's turmoil suggested that it was related to the boy she so admired. Hinata pressed her lips together, even as her forefingers began to push against each other. Her posture was hunched over as normal, but the quaver in her voice when she spoke was something new to Kurenai's ears. "Ano." Naruto caught up to us part of the way there. We asked him about his extra training, and he told us he was working with Guy-sensei as we walked the rest of the way. Kurenai frowned at that. She'd hoped the boy would have more sense than to brag like that, but she supposed he was still making up for what had happened in the academy. Still, she'd have to talk to him about this. Hinata took a calming breath. When Shino said he'd heard of Guy, Naruto replied that you told him his taijutsu was so bad that you didn't think you could fix it yourself. She paused for a moment, and then continued in a rush. Why did you say something like that to Naruto? He tries so hard and no one ever gives him any credit. Kurenai rocked back on her metaphorical heels, but tried not to let anything show on her face. It wasn't like she hadn't actively encouraged Hinata to assert herself when they talked, but it seemed like her words had just been wasted air. And now, this same girl was questioning her judgment where Naruto was concerned. As breakthroughs went, it was a minor thing, but Uzuamki Kurenai had learned as a genin to take whatever successes she could find. How she handled this was important, at least it was if she wanted Hinata to build on this. Hyuga Hinata, before I say anything else, I want you to know that I am pleased that you have taken me at my word when I said I wanted you to ask questions when you don't understand something. This was not a question I had anticipated, but I am pleased that you trust me enough to ask me about this, Kurenai concluded with a smile. That said, I would ask you if Shino had any expression on his face when he mentioned Gai-sensei. Hinata frowned in confusion. Kurenai-sensei. I did not notice anything, but... Her voice trailed off. But you were focusing on Naruto as he spoke, Kurenai supplied helpfully. I ask this because that was not exactly how I described the situation to Naruto when I told him he would be working with Gai. I think he chose his words so that you and Shino would not think he was receiving favorable treatment. My arrangement with Gai is unusual among Jonin sensei. Naruto's unusual stamina means that he can make up the time he lost at the academy faster than most. Our arrangement will facilitate this. It is because of Naruto's strengths, including his willingness to work hard, that this was done. Hinata looked more than slightly mortified. She ducked her head down again as she stuttered out, Jigomen, Kurenai-sensei. None of that, Hinata, Kurenai said sharply. Your loyalty to your teammate is commendable, and I specifically instructed you to ask me questions like this. At some point, you may become an advisor to a village leader or umbu captain. Under those circumstances, not speaking up would be an abandonment of your duties. I am also glad to hear that Naruto was considerate of the feelings of his teammates when a potentially uncomfortable subject was raised. Naruto is never cruel, Hinata said quickly, then stopped and swallowed. No, he isn't, Kurenai agreed, but he doesn't always realize when he's giving offense to others, does he? But he means well, and that counts for a lot. All he has to do is just learn to think in another's place, part of seeing underneath the underneath. You have just given me proof that he is making progress in that area, and for that I thank you. Hinata's cheeks pinked and she nodded in acknowledgement. Kurenai frowned at her and decided to take a stab in the dark. Something else happened, though, didn't it? Hinata let out a sigh and began describing the confrontation with Team 7. Kurenai nodded thoughtfully, smiling when Hinata related the warm greeting Ichiraku's proprietor had given them. She'd have to find an excuse to talk to the man at some point. Naruto might just be a regular customer to the man, but it wouldn't do to make assumptions. She did raise her palm at one point to ask a question. Are you quite sure you felt the killing intent coming from Sasuke before Naruto turned around? Hinata nodded quickly. Good, Kurenai said with a smile. I am glad he did not do anything to provoke Uchiha. I'll be having words with Kakashi about controlling his students if anyone tries to make something of this. However, Uzuamki Kurenai was highly annoyed by the time Hinata was finished with her story. I almost hope the owner of Ichiraku does file a complaint against them for interfering with his customers, she growled. She frowned at her student. Hinata, you did nothing worse than standing up for your teammate. Activating your Byakugan, consciously or not, is not an offensive action by itself. Sakura did not look like she expected that, did she? Hinata slowly shook her head. I don't understand why she can be so cruel to Naruto-kun, she said, the honorific barely whispered, but Kurenai's ears were sharp. The Jonin cleared her throat. I think it's because she's a silly, shallow girl. She chases after Sasuke for the same reasons many of the other kunoichi do, and she cannot appreciate the subtle qualities of others. Subtle qualities? Her student asked. Most people see Naruto and dismiss him as a prankster or worse, Kurenai replied, skating around the edges of the Hokage slaw. You've told me yourself that you appreciate his cheerful nature and how he always keeps trying, no matter what. Those are actually very good qualities for a shinobi to have. It is wrong that you are the first person to notice this. Aside from Umino Irika, I don't have a lot of respect for the teachers at the Konoha Ninja Academy. Hinata's pale eyes widened at this admission. Kurenai knew she was laying it on a little thick, but Hinata's tendency to second-guess herself was holding her back. That vague sense of urgency she felt was also pushing her to become less circumspect in her dealings with the girl. Honestly, Kurenai continued, I think you see Naruto better than many. And he needs people that understand him more than you know. Between you and me, she said, lowering her voice in a conspiratorial manner, I think he needs friends as well as teammates. Would you like to be more than just his teammate? Kurenai phrased the last question innocently enough, and she suppressed a grin as Hinata's face immediately went bright red. Her suspicions confirmed, she looked up at the morning sky as her student collected herself. Hyuga Hayashi might very well die of apoplexy if he knew what she'd just learned, but that was far too kind a fate for him. I would like to be his friend, Hinata finally said. Good. I think you are making an excellent start, Kurenai said. Just keep in mind that he hasn't had many people defend him over the years, so he may not understand why you do it. She didn't add that it was said that this was the case, as sad as the fact that Hinata had no experience with being appreciated or complimented. Sometimes Kurenai felt like she was a medic in a ward full of broken bodies, only what she was trying to repair here was harder to heal than mere flesh. She was broken out of this reverie by Shino's arrival. The Abarame boy was as quiet and expressionless as ever, but Kurenai could almost feel his attention shift back and forth between herself and Hinata. Hinata informed me about the altercation last night, she said. Shino appeared to straighten slightly inside his long coat, but it might have been Kurenai's mind picking up subtler indications and filling in the blanks for her. Our conduct was within the guidelines set forth for shinobi at the academy, he said, a little stiffly. Kurenai nodded. And I was about to compliment you both on your handling of the situation. Shino nodded in turn, accepting her implied criticism of his defensiveness. Will there be repercussions from this? He asked. Only for them. Your conduct was above reproach, all of you, even Naruto. He left while being insulted, rather than retaliate. That speaks highly of his maturity, of all your maturity, Kurenai added. Then her expression hardened. If there is an inquiry of any sort, I will deal with it, and make whoever raised it sorry to have done so. Shino stood there for a moment, and Kurenai could almost hear the gears turning behind those dark glasses of his. Finally, he nodded again. Kurenai felt like the boy was still forming his own opinions of her as well as his teammates. She wasn't sure whether her last statement would move him positively or negatively, but she guessed the former to be the case. After all, logic would maintain that they had followed the Konoha Shinobi Code of Conduct to the letter, and logic was something Shino, like many Abaramis, seemed to inordinately prize. I would suggest, she said, that we not mention this incident to Naruto unless he brings it up. They were his classmates and it was him that was being targeted, so it may not be a comfortable subject. But if you can bring this sort of cohesiveness to our field missions, they will become much easier to accomplish. What was that about missions? Naruto asked as he landed in the middle of the clearing. Kurenai felt her blood change to ice. Her student had discarded the uniform Mikitaro had spent so much effort altering the previous day. Instead, he was wearing a bright green leotard that bunched up in odd places on his small frame. The burnt umber leg warmers were there as well, with the toes of his sandals barely poking out of the fabric pooled around his ankles. Topping it off, his hair had been unevenly dyed black, so some of it was ebony, some bits were still blonde, and gray-yellow streaks abounded. It had also been hued, apparently with a dull kunao, into a crude approximation of a very distinctive bowl cut. Guy had practically sworn not to do this. Naruto wasn't supposed to make major changes to his equipment without consulting her. She'd taken so damn many precautions, only to see this, after only one training session. She didn't know how her kunao had gotten into her hand, all she knew was that it felt very, very right somehow. I am going to kill Guy in his sleep, she snarled. He promised me. No, I'm going to just sever his spinal cord and let him live as a quadriplegic. Naruto had taken a step back, as did her other startled genins. He seemed to be having some sort of difficulty moving. Or was it breathing? Abruptly, he bent forward and his legs buckled. His rear end hit the ground and there was a loud pop and a puff of smoke. When it cleared, Naruto was lying curled up on the ground, in his new uniform, holding his stomach and laughing until tears began to leak from his eyes. Kurenai stared at her student, realizing that she'd just been had. She'd been so shocked by Naruto's appearance that she hadn't even thought to check for a henge. He'd conned her, and quite skillfully under the circumstances. She tried to keep a straight face, but the corner of her mouth kept twitching as she stared at her genin. Naruto sat up abruptly, as if he felt her eyes boring into him. He scratched at the back of his head and tried to stifle his laughter. I promised I wouldn't pull any more pranks in the village, but I didn't say I'd completely stop, he explained in a sheepish tone. Kurenai gave it up as a lost cause and let out a bark of laughter, something that hadn't been heard in Konoha for many years. She saw her other genin's eyes widen as she laughed along with the blonde-haired prankster. Very good, Naruto. I hadn't extracted a completely binding promise from you, had I? She asked rhetorically. Now, do you know why your little joke worked so well? Naruto sat up straighter and frowned. Hinata had a faint smile on her face, no doubt from seeing Naruto fully recovered from the previous night. Shino was, well, Shino. Naruto shook his head. Kurenai kneeled on the ground, getting comfortable and motioned for the others to do the same. That was a very realistic henge, but normally, I can see through a henge a block away. I am a genjutsu specialist after all. But I didn't immediately think to check. Why was that? Naruto frowned, concentrating, but it was Shino who spoke up first. You were clearly agitated by the apparent changes to his appearance. This obviously interfered with conducting logical thought processes. Kurenai nodded. That's part of the answer. From what you said earlier, about when you said I'd still be your student, Naruto said slowly, you repeated that several times, but it didn't make sense until I'd seen Lee. Then I understood that if Guy made Lee dress like him, you might be afraid he'd do the same with me, he concluded, shuddering at the thought. Exactly. And if I was afraid it would happen, then I obviously considered it to be at least remotely possible, correct? Kurenai asked. Shino spoke up. So he showed you something you at least partially expected to see, and made sure that it was sufficiently upsetting that you would react without thinking first, he summarized. Exactly, Kurenai agreed. Now, while this was a good prank, you can also apply those principles on missions, can't you? What followed was a rather stimulating discussion on using misdirection and knowledge of the enemy's emotional hot buttons, both on the battlefield and to accomplish mission objectives. The latter was more applicable for a reconnaissance team, but all three of her genins contributed to the discussion. Hinata had evidently been paying attention in her classes, for she was able to effortlessly recall details from various famous missions they'd studied at the academy. Naturally, Shino settled into a role as the critic for their various strategies, picking apart their plans and exposing every weakness. Uzuamki Naruto was as creative as his additions to the Hokage monument suggested. What was surprising was his ability to put together a plan almost instantly when presented with a situation and an objective. Kurenai slowly began to realize that Naruto's pranks had given him a thorough grounding in operational planning that many shinobi 3 times his age lacked. For the most part, Kurenai would simply present them with a situation, then sit back and watch them hash it out. Sometimes it would take Naruto several attempts to come up with a plan that Shino would approve. Hinata stayed out of the discussions at first. She turned pink and looked down immediately after correcting Shino regarding the range of a sand country hunting boomerang. That interruption did not pass unnoticed by either boy, and soon they were working on drawing her into the planning sessions, usually by asking her specific questions. By the end of the hour, her genins' heads appeared to be buzzing with all the new thoughts and ideas they'd assimilated. Despite herself, Kurenai was a little impressed by the way they'd worked together. Oh. That all for What If Naruto Found Uzuamki Library, Part 4. If you like the story so far, please show your support by liking the video and subscribing to my channel, and show your support to the author by following the link down in the description. Thanks for listening, and until next time.